Thank you everyone for joining us today. It is an honor to be with you, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this webinar on how parents can support teens with the changing challenges of COVID, presented by Dr. Jung and Dr. Fordwood. My name is Mari Kurahashi, and I'm a child psychiatrist in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. I also co-direct the Stanford Parenting Center with my colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Ray-Sher. Today's webinar is our second in our three-part Spring 2021 Positive Parenting During COVID-19 series hosted by our Department of Psychiatry. Last month, Dr. Madeline Levine presented on Parenting Through the Pandemic, Building Resilience in Our Children and Ourselves. And next month, on June 2nd, our NYU colleagues, Dr. Rebecca Berry and Dr. Mark Krepley, will present on From Zoom Screen to Sunscreen, Managing the Transition Towards an In-Person World. Next slide, please. It has now been over a year since we launched our Positive Parenting During COVID-19 webinar series, and we have received over 5,000 views. Our catalog of webinars can be found on our website, listed here on the bottom. We'll also be sending an email following today's webinar with this information as well. In addition, we're offering a more personalized resource for parents, our Positive Parenting consultation groups. These small groups are designed to build on the information provided during our webinars and provide additional education and scientifically based tools to support your child or adolescent. The registration for the Pediatric Anxiety and Stress Group, as well as the Organizational Skills Training Group for parents or children with ADHD, is currently open. Next slide, please. I'll also be teaching an online mindful parenting class starting on June 15th. Registration is also available through our website. Next slide, please. So now let me just reiterate a very warm welcome to everyone who has joined us today for our webinar. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Eunie Jung and Dr. Samantha Fordwood with us, and I'm thrilled to introduce them. Dr. Jung received her Ph.D. from UCLA, where she researched treatment outcomes for child and adolescent depression and anxiety. Her clinical training includes working at the UCLA Student Counseling Center and an internship and postdoctoral fellowship at the SFVA, where she specialized in anxiety and trauma disorders. Since then, Dr. Jung has worked in the VA system for several years and has extensive experience in evidence-based therapies. She is now an associate professor and the program director for the clinical psychology graduate program at the California School of Professional Psychology at Alliant University in Sacramento. Dr. Samantha Fordwood received her doctoral degree in clinical psychology from UCLA, where both her clinical and research experiences focused on treatments for children and adolescents, namely cognitive behavioral therapy. She specializes in dialectical behavioral therapy, an evidence-based treatment that addresses a wide range of emotional and behavioral issues and involves the practice of emotion regulation, distress tolerance, interpersonal effectiveness, and mindfulness skills. Dr. Fordwood is currently an associate clinical professor in the Wavefront DBT program at UCSF, where she works with teens, young adults, and their parents, as well as supervises trainees and teaches about DBT. We'll spend the first portion of the webinar on presentations and then have time for questions afterwards. Please submit your questions through the chat function located at the bottom of your screen. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Jung and Dr. Fordwood. Thank you.
Again, welcome everyone. We're so glad you can join us today. Thank you for making time in your busy schedules for this. I want to start by providing an overview of what we'll be talking about today. For the first part of the webinar, that's right, next slide, there we go. For the first part of the webinar, I will be reviewing typical adolescent development and how the current COVID landscape might be impacting teens and families during this time. Then Dr. Fordwood will provide some information about common challenges teens may be facing during COVID and some strategies that parents, caregivers, and teens might find useful in helping navigate these. Next slide. Before we start, it's important to acknowledge just the enormity of the past 14 plus months that we've all been going through. As we're beginning to feel and see the light at the end of the tunnel, I think it's important to recognize that just as we transition to living in the time of COVID, there's going to be a transition to a time without it. And just as there was no roadmap for how to adjust to the pandemic, there is no right way to adjust to coming out of it. So as we go through this talk, it's important to recognize that there's no normal. This talk is about offering support and a few suggestions, and for you to take what is helpful or relevant for you, and really leaving the rest behind if you'd like. One of my favorite phrases is good enough parenting, which was coined by Donald Winnicott, a famous pediatrician and psychoanalyst. And I think this phrase applies to our current time really perfectly. The idea here is that a child doesn't need us to be perfect parents, which doesn't exist anyway, but that it is actually in our child's best interest if we balance when we're there for them with letting them also experience the world for what it is, at times frustrating, disappointing, and painful. So this is really perfect for now because the majority of us have experienced some of this past year. COVID has been at times frustrating, disappointing, and painful. And so if you can come away from our talk today with a little more compassion for yourself and your teen and feeling a little more validated, then I'd feel pretty good about that. And finally, while everyone has been impacted by COVID, there are some teens and families who have been disproportionately impacted, and it's important to recognize that. The inequities in our world have been laid to bear, and for many have become much worse. So we've all had a different journey through this, and we'll address this a little more later on in our talk. Next slide. To provide a backdrop for talking about positive teen parenting during the changing COVID landscape, we thought it'd be helpful to review what typical teen development looks like. The period of adolescence is such a rich period of many changes. So before talking about the impact of this last year and its many changes, providing an overview of typical adolescent development from biological to emotional to cognitive and social will be helpful to keep in mind. Because while there's a lot going on outside in the world, there's also a lot going on inside your teen as well. So I'm going to start with the biology about adolescent development in the bottom right-hand yellow corner. Dr. Dan Siegel, a child psychiatrist from UCLA, refers to adolescence as a period when the brain is under construction. While during childhood, the brain is like a sponge soaking up a ton of information, during adolescence, the unused connections in the thinking and processing part of your child's brain are pruned away, while other pathways are strengthened. This is the brain's way of becoming more efficient, based on the use it or lose it principle. This pruning process begins in the back of the brain, while the front of the brain, called the prefrontal cortex, is remodeled last. The prefrontal cortex is the decision-making part of the brain responsible for your teen's ability to plan and think about the consequences of actions, solve problems, and control impulses. And changes in this part of the brain continue actually into early adulthood. Because the prefrontal cortex is still developing during adolescence, teenagers might rely on a part of the brain called the amygdala to make decisions and solve problems, more than adults do. This amygdala is associated with emotions, instinctive behaviors, and even aggression, which is why we might see bigger feelings and more impulsivity at this time. The release of dopamine also increases during adolescence, resulting in the emergence of an increased drive for reward or for looking for things that feel good, and possibly increased feelings of boredom as it takes more for adolescents to feel excited or engaged. There are also hormonal changes associated with puberty, including increased secretion of growth and sex hormones, and related physical changes with this increased hormone production. So I'm going to move next to the green section there, emotional. So as these changes in the brain are occurring, there are also direct impacts to the way emotions are experienced and expressed. During adolescence, you might start to see different and more emotions in your teen. This is in part because the more dominant role of the amygdala is contributing to intensified emotions. Increased dopamine release, which I mentioned as a biological change, can also lead to more impulsivity and risk-taking behavior. There are, of course, individual variations in this emotional expression. Our personality or temperament plays a role in how these are experienced and expressed. And of course, as we've all probably witnessed over the last year plus, our emotions are also related to what's going on in the environment. So moving on to the blue corner, cognitive. The pruning of the brain that I mentioned earlier leads to cognitive changes in your teen as well, including the ability to think more complexly, to take multiple perspectives, and to problem solve more skillfully. And there are differences between younger versus older teens. So for example, a 12-year-old might be more focused on themselves in comparison to an older teen who might be able to take a much broader perspective overall. But in general, youth at this age are much more able to perceive and understand and question what is going on around them and start to form independent opinions as well. You might also see your teen engage in what Dr. Siegel terms hyperrationality, which is looking at things from a very concrete perspective and downplaying the negatives and focusing more on the positives of something that's desired. And this might actually lead to more follow through on impulsive behaviors. And then moving to the last corner in the red, one of the hallmark changes during adolescence is, of course, the increased importance of social connections with peers. Friendships are typically of central importance, and this is usually when interest in romantic relationships emerges. And actually, this is, our brain is programmed to do this, is to kind of look out more outside the family for social support. However, though teens are engaging more with friends and turning to them for support and advice, parents can and should still stay involved. While they're developing a sense of autonomy and independence, teens still do need and will seek guidance from parents. So all of these different aspects of development do not flow linearly from one to another, the way they look on the screen, but they all interact with each other in various ways. But working together, they all contribute to an adolescent's growing sense of identity during this really important time. Okay, next slide, please. Another important framework to put in place as we talk about positive parenting in the changing time of COVID is to outline where we've been. For the past 14 plus months, we have all been through tremendous change. It's really hard to overstate this. Whoever thought schools would or could close? There have been shifts in almost every area of a teen's and our own lives. Changes in the way we learn, socialize, changes in our living arrangements, all of these are different. So it's natural that reactions to these various changes have a wide range, from emotional responses and distress, questions and confusion about what's going on, even our daily patterns of eating and sleeping and moving are likely different. And it's important to remember that these reactions in your teen might be a combination of the natural process of typical adolescent development and COVID-related environmental stressors. And finally, as teens are experiencing these changes, there are various ways that they might adjust and cope. Of course, almost all of us have seen more screen time, parents and teens, and it's not only been a way for teens to stay connected during this time, but also a way that many teens are coping with so many changes. For many of them, this is the primary way they've stayed socially connected during COVID. And something positive that's developed for many teens is creativity in using more of the unstructured time they have. So maybe, hopefully you've seen some of this. And then finally, again, during a time when teens are developmentally usually branching out more, COVID may have resulted in more reliance on parents or siblings to cope with change. Next slide, please. The experiences we've had so far and upcoming changes will depend on each family and individual situation. While the pandemic has been difficult in some ways for many, there are significant inequities in the ways that teens have been impacted. The racial inequities that have always existed in our country have now been exacerbated and highlighted by financial, academic, health disparities, to name a few, during COVID. The racial justice movements, including Black Lives Matter and Stop AAP I Hate, are not about new injustice. But one of the positives that has come out of the past year, I think, is that there has been an increased awareness about racism during COVID. For adolescents who identify with a marginalized racial group, and maybe also for those who do not, the past year may have had many different impacts. Adolescents and teens with pre-existing vulnerabilities were likely to have been marginalized before the pandemic, and now are probably even more impacted. Months and months of distance learning have been disproportionately more difficult for families who really need in-person, individualized supports for their students. And of course, there are other challenges as well outside of school that COVID has made even harder for these families. Socioeconomic disparities have been exacerbated during the pandemic, and one of the ways our youth may have experienced this is in the inequities in access to education and services. The experience of learning during COVID could have been dependent on many factors. Did your teen attend a public or a private school? Did they have a learning pod, a personal tutor? What school district were they in? And for so many, too many youth, did they have a learning experience at all? Was Wi-Fi or technology even consistently available? And finally, for some of our most underprivileged youth who did not have a stable home situation before the pandemic, the lack of access to schools may have resulted in a lack of safety as well. We have been very fortunate in our country with vaccines. We're currently at about a 50, actually 60% vaccination rate for one shot. For those youth with family and friends in other countries though, vaccination rates are much lower. And in some countries like India, hospitalization and death rates continue to be very high. These adolescents may be dealing with the added stress of not being able to connect with loved ones in person, even now that our own country is opening up. They might be worrying about the health and safety of their faraway loved ones and wondering when they might see them again. Next slide, please. In the context of all the changes that adolescents are going through developmentally, and after a year plus of tremendous change, we are still in the midst of lots of change and with lots of change still to come. So here we are in May, where we're really beginning to transition to some in-person activities. With the increasing vaccination rates, as of today, actually over 60% of adults in the US have received one dose, which is great news. And parts of California and the Bay Area are probably higher. So with this, this increase in vaccination rates, some schools have transitioned to in-person to varying degrees. We've also seen social distancing guidelines shift this month, and the CDC's masking mandate has also changed. So lots of change, we're in the midst of change. As we move into summer, it already feels much different than a year ago. Last spring, most of the US, including California, was in the process of sheltering in place. And now we're in the process of opening up. California is expected to be open for business in mid-June, and there will be lots more options probably for activities for teens, including opportunities to meet friends in person and for travel. However, not everyone will be vaccinated, so that will be a variable to navigate. And there also will be varying work situations. Some parents who are formerly working from home, possibly returning to the workplace, while others will still be continuing remotely. And as we look towards the fall, there will hopefully be more changes to look forward to. Vaccines for ages 2 and up are scheduled for approval in the fall, and with that, schools will hopefully be even more open. Those schedules and masks are still variables that are unknown. A couple of things to consider is that not all kids will be back, which might be an adjustment for your teen. And finally, although vaccines seem to be effective against variants, it's still uncertain how the role of these will unfold. Next slide, please. Focusing more on the immediate future, with the vaccination rate for those 16 and up rising, and again with the vaccine officially being approved for use in teens 12 to 15, there's a lot for teens and parents to celebrate this summer. For some families, these changes in the COVID landscape prompt feelings of happiness, relief, hope, excitement, and they're able to jump in and engage in in-person activities like going to class, modified school social events, summer jobs, camps, seeing friends, summer vacations, and they feel excited about the likelihood of full in-person school in the fall. For many teens and parents though, the emotional reaction is probably a bit more complicated. While they too may feel some relief and happiness, there may also be anxiety, disappointment, frustration, and other emotions that can be difficult to navigate. Keeping in mind what's typical for adolescents, parents can help their teens continue to develop emotionally and socially to foster the development of a healthy sense of self as we go through this next stage of COVID. And Dr. Fordwood will be talking next about some possible strategies and skills to help with this.
Next slide, please. So based on experiences in our clinical work, conversations with colleagues and friends, and from articles in the media, here are some of the more difficult emotional reactions to the recent changes with the COVID situation. While a lot of progress has been made, it has been a long year of anxiety, uncertainty, hardships, and loss. And it makes sense that we can't just flip a switch and move on from all that we've been through since March of 2020. The anxiety, sadness, frustration, envy, guilt that you may be seeing in your teen or feeling yourself are often normative responses to rather unusual circumstances. Thinking about typical adolescent development, with the teenage brain being under construction, we know that teens experience bigger and stronger emotional reactions than adults, and that executive functioning abilities are less developed. This means that teens may be more likely to make decisions based on how they are feeling in the moment. Parents can play a significant role in helping teens recognize and cope with their emotions, as well as guide more effective decision-making. So we'll discuss some skills and strategies that can help teens as well as parents. We all learn by watching others, so you modeling being skillful for your teen can go a long way. Next slide, please. Validation is a key strategy for emotion regulation and communication. You can use this skill in pretty much all interpersonal situations, and it is also helpful to talk to yourself in a validating way. So what exactly is validation? Validation communicates to another person or to yourself that their experience makes sense. It is empathy or feeling with someone plus communication of that empathy. Validation doesn't solve the problem or change a situation. It does, however, help people feel better, feel seen and understood, and feel like they aren't alone. Now, it's much easier to validate someone when they are clearly saying what they think, feel, and want. And that clear expression is often not how conversations play out in real life. Perhaps your teen is barely saying anything to you at all. Through the use of validation, you can encourage more communication and increase your and your teen's understanding of what is really going on. In order to solve a problem, we first need to know what the problem is. So, how exactly do you use this skill? As listed here, there are 7 different ways we can validate. For example, perhaps your teen's school has opened up for some in-person classes, and your teen comes out of their room and says, "I'm not going to school today. I don't feel like it." With level 1 validation, you would give them your full attention, put down your phone, close your laptop, stop what you're doing. In level 2, you repeat back what you are hearing without adding anything. Perhaps say something like, "Sounds like you don't feel like going to school today." With level 3, you do a little mind reading and take a guess at what they might be feeling or thinking. It's important to phrase your mind reading as a possibility, not as a fact. Something like, "I wonder if you may be feeling nervous about going back to school in person." And perhaps, if you're lucky, you get a nod from your teen. With level 4 validation, you acknowledge the specific cause or causes. Well, it makes sense to feel nervous. You haven't been to class in person or been in any large group of people in a long time. When possible, try to use a level 5 validation, as this normalizes the experience by saying most people would feel the same way. You could say, "I think many people are feeling some anxiety about going back to school. It's a really big change for everyone." In level 6 validation, the goal is to be genuine, to just be a fellow human being. You might say something like, "I felt nervous when I first went back to work too." Or level 6 might be a genuine expression about not understanding and really wanting to. So going back to your level 3 mind reading validation, perhaps you say to your teen, "I wonder if you may be feeling nervous about going back to school in person." And they say to you, "You just don't get it at all." A level 6 validation may be something like, "You're right, I'm not fully understanding, and I really want to. So can you tell me more?" Now we know this is all easier said than done, and you may not get exactly the reaction you were hoping for, certainly not each time. And by consistently using validation and modeling it for your teen, you are enhancing understanding, improving communication, increasing connection, and decreasing emotional arousal. One last point about validation. It is not agreement. You can validate that your teen feels anxious about something, without having to say that you also feel anxious about it if you don't. You can validate that your teen may want to avoid activities because they feel anxious, and you don't have to agree that avoiding is the best solution. By validating someone else's perspective, you don't have to give up your own. Both perspectives, even if quite different, can be valid. Next slide, please. So there are lots of ways that anxiety is showing up for teens right now, as well as for their parents. It's also important to keep in mind that we can feel both anxious and happy and excited and relieved all at the same time. Some of the current anxiety for teens and for parents is about potential COVID risk as activities open up. We have spent the last 14 months hearing about the threat of COVID and the need to stay safe. So it's understandable that there is a fair amount of anxiety about it, even still. A lot of current anxiety is more socially based, such as feeling nervous about being in large social groups and feeling kind of rusty with our social skills. Parents can likely relate to some discomfort about entering social activities again, maybe asking questions like, if we're all vaccinated, do we still wear masks? Do we shake hands? Do we not? Can we hug? Can we share a meal together? There's just so much for us to adjust to these days. For teens, there may also be concerns about others' perceptions of physical changes that have occurred over the past year. Some teens have become very used to wearing masks, maybe even liking being somewhat hidden. And as restrictions lift over the next few months, they may feel uncomfortable showing their whole face to the world again. Some have found a lot of comfort in living a more virtual existence this past year, and the prospect of living life in person again feels quite daunting. Teens may also be experiencing stress about academics, ranging from pressure to do well despite learning remotely over the past year, to concerns about failing classes and having to repeat grades, to significant difficulties just engaging in school remotely at all. The college process has also been challenging during COVID for many different reasons. We know that adolescence is a time when teens tend to turn toward peers, and that having effective social relationships with peers is healthy for development. So parents can help support their teens returning to in-person activities, whether that be at school or just hanging out with friends. Next slide, please. Before we talk about how to manage anxiety, let's first take a look at how anxiety works. All emotions have a function. If they didn't, they wouldn't have stuck around throughout evolution. Emotions give us information. They are one way we experience the world around us. The purpose of anxiety or fear is to keep you safe. It tells you to avoid danger. So fear fits the facts when there is a real threat to your life, health, or well-being, or to that of someone you care about. Acting on anxiety and the urge to avoid is effective when the anxiety fits the facts, as this keeps us safe from actual danger. Look at the example on the left from spring 2020. When the shelter-in-place order went into effect, we had very limited knowledge about the coronavirus. We did know that it was making some people very sick, was potentially lethal, and that it was spreading. Thoughts that the virus was dangerous fit the facts, as did feeling anxiety about it. Acting on the urge to avoid the virus by staying home was the most effective thing to do. When anxiety does not fit the facts, because the perceived threat is not actually dangerous, then acting on the anxiety by avoiding is not effective, because then we avoid doing things that are safe. The anxiety sticks around and gets in the way of us living our lives, keeping us stuck. Take a look at the example on the right about feeling anxious about returning to in-person activities. The thoughts about engaging in social activities may be that there's a threat, that others will reject you. This leads to feeling anxious physically and emotionally, and you have the urge to avoid. By acting on the avoidance and staying home, you feel a sense of relief in the short term, which reinforces the choice to avoid. And the cycle continues, making it harder and harder to engage in social activities and prove the anxiety wrong. Next slide, please. The skill of checking the facts helps us identify what the problem actually is and whether or not the emotion you are experiencing fits the facts. It helps you to determine whether it's the situation or the emotion or the intensity of the emotion, that is the problem. If it is the situation that's the problem, then we want to listen to the emotion, act on it, and engage in problem solving. If it is the emotion that's the problem, then we want to do the opposite of the action urge. In the case of anxiety, that would be to approach, not avoid, so that we can decrease the intensity of the emotion. Now, it has been really hard with COVID to check the facts. It's a new situation for everyone, and we are learning about the virus as we go. At times, there have been mixed messages about what is safe and not safe, which adds to the confusion. With vaccines being available to everyone 12 and up, increasing vaccination rates, the current situation in California in relation to COVID-19 is dramatically different than it was in the spring of 2020, or even just in January of this year. In the New York Times today, as Dr. Jung was saying, that over 60% of Americans have received at least one dose of the vaccine. And for the first time since March of 2020, there are no COVID patients at SF General Hospital, which is really quite amazing. So in terms of COVID risk, things in the United States have improved significantly. It's important to note that while we have learned a lot and have many more facts than a year ago, things are still not 100% certain or clear. In any given situation, there will be some degree of uncertainty, even if we check the facts as best we can. So kind of no matter what, we're going to have to tolerate some degree of uncertainty. Next slide, please. Many of the returning to in-person situations that are currently prompting anxiety can be addressed using opposite action. In these cases, the anxiety, or at least high intensity anxiety, often does not fit the facts, as the threat is not actually as dangerous as it feels. Acting on anxiety by avoiding when it is not warranted creates more anxiety. This leads to increased avoidance of school, social activities, whatever it is that you are feeling anxious about. So while it is really hard to use opposite action in the short term, in the long run, approaching rather than avoiding will make post-pandemic living much easier. For example, most schools in California are predicting to be fully in person in the fall. By using opposite action this spring and summer to address social or COVID-related anxieties, the start of the school year will feel a lot more doable and perhaps even exciting. First, you're going to want to validate the anxiety, even though it doesn't fit the facts. Now, emotions are a full system response, and it's really hard to do the opposite of what we feel. And if adolescents experience more intense emotions than adults, along with a less developed prefrontal cortex to guide decision-making, using opposite action may be even harder for teens. Then we want to do the opposite action, approach, not avoid. And we want to adopt opposite thoughts. I can do this. I am okay. Opposite facial expression, opposite body posture. We want to do opposite action all the way. When we're thinking about approaching, we want to do this step by step, using what we call an exposure hierarchy. So ranking activities by order of anxiety, starting where it's difficult and still doable, and then move up the activities list over time. So some examples would be for school avoidance, you might work on increasing the number of days that you attend in person, the length of time spent at school. For social activities, you might want to think about, is there different anxiety levels related with different people, with the group size, with different places. And for masks in the future, when it's safe to do so, when it's safe to not wear a mask, showing your face, more fully to more and to different people for various amounts of time. And as parents, we want to provide encouragement and reinforcement along the way. For many of the current situations discussed earlier that prompt anxiety, such as returning to safe in-person activities when fully vaccinated, while some degree of anxiety may fit the facts, a very high intensity level of anxiety would not. In cases like this, you would use a combination of opposite action and problem solving. For opposite action, you would approach, so go to school, engage in social activities, so that you can bring down the intensity of the anxiety. And then you'd want to use problem solving, wearing masks indoors, socially distanced, to address the anxiety that does actually fit the facts. Next slide, please. There has been a lot of loss this past year, Even with all the recent positive changes, things are not how they were in 2019, and we still have a way to go before we can establish a more stable new normal. There's a huge range of losses. Some people have lost loved ones. Everyone has lost time with loved ones. Teens have lost typical adolescent experiences, such as hanging out with friends, dating, high school traditions, proms, graduations. And of course, they have lost lots of time in school. For some adolescents, there's been no in-person school at all since March of 2020, a massive educational and social loss. Given that developmentally, teens may experience more intense emotions, and that adolescence is typically a time when social experiences with peers play a central role, the losses of typical adolescent experiences may feel particularly salient. Even in teens who may be feeling happy about the progress made and returning to in-person activities, there may still be sadness, and that's okay. Sadness is a normative response to loss. Here are some suggestions for how to address sadness with your teen. First, let your teen talk and just listen. You don't have to fix the problem, and often they don't really want you to. Then validate the sadness and disappointment by acknowledging the specific losses. So perhaps saying something, it makes sense you feel sad. Your senior year was not how you thought it would be. Also want to think about what not to say. It's really tempting to try to distract from the sadness and the negatives and want to focus on the positives. And this totally makes sense as we want to make our loved one feel better. Unfortunately, this often feels invalidating and can make things worse. So if your teen is upset that their graduation is just going to be online, saying something like, well, at least you get to have some sort of graduation, is probably not going to go over very well. Use both and rather than either or but statements, allowing both sides to be true. So validating how difficult something is now, and then you can also point out that things are getting better. If you're having trouble feeling compassion or empathy for your teen and what they're struggling with, you can try thinking about the own losses you've experienced this year. When sadness fits the facts and the loss is actually changeable, try problem solving. So this may look like scheduling social activities now that it's safe to do so if the sadness is about the loss of those activities. When the loss is not changeable, when something has already happened, you can't go back, nothing we can do about it, then you're going to want to encourage the practice of acceptance. And you can do this through a lot of validation. When the intensity of sadness does not fit the facts, or when sadness seems to be growing, or it's going on for a very, very long time, you might want to consider using opposite action for sadness and encouraging engaging, not withdrawing. So trying to increase activities so that your teen is more active and participating more in their life. Next slide, please. Anger and conflict about restrictions has been an ongoing issue for teens and parents during the pandemic. One of the ways that anger fits the facts is when an important goal is blocked or a desired activity is interrupted. So teens wanting to spend time with their peers is developmentally appropriate and often a highly desired activity. So it makes sense for them to want this and to feel very frustrated by the limitations on social activities caused by COVID. As part of typical adolescent development, teens have a stronger dopamine-based drive for reward and can be more likely than adults to take risks or to be impulsive. They may focus on the positives or short-term rewards rather than take a step back and consider the bigger picture. The normative drive for social engagement makes it hard for teens to miss out on what their peers are doing. So when COVID rates were high and vaccines were not available, anxiety about the virus risk fit the facts, and the recommended guidelines for everyone were strict. Parents could fall back on these general guidelines, and their house rules and expectations could be thought to be somewhat similar across different families. That is actually not the case now, and it may be a tougher job for parents to hold the line on stricter restrictions. Different families have different situations. Some may need to maintain more restrictions for safety, such as having underlying health issues at home, an elderly or sick family member who's not vaccinated, or there are younger children at home who are not yet able to be vaccinated. And then please note that it's important for parents to check the facts and make sure that their restrictions, that their house rules, accurately reflect the current situation rather than are driven by parents' anxiety. To manage manage anger about restrictions, first validate your teen's frustration or anger, as well as acknowledging the unfairness of the situation. Clearly communicate the reasons for the continued restrictions, and remember to check the facts first, and offer to reevaluate when situations change. So family members' vaccination status or case rates in the community. It's important to communicate as a team with your partner, ensuring that the message to your teen is clear and consistent. Use positive reinforcement to shape the behaviors you want to see more of, rather than relying on punishment. Ask for your teen for help in coming up with rewards for following the guidelines. If you have their buy-in, then anger and conflict will likely decrease. Another way that anger is showing up is as a secondary emotion to more vulnerable emotions. For many people, it's easier to feel and express anger and frustration than to acknowledge feeling scared or sad. For example, if your teen is angrily complaining that things aren't fair because of limited social activities or an online graduation ceremony, you might say, "I'm guessing you feel super disappointed about that. I bet a lot of your friends are sad about it too." By validating and addressing the underlying primary emotions of sadness or anxiety, the anger may also subside. One last point about anger. As with all emotions, anger is not bad. It too serves an important function, namely to protect us and our loved ones when attacked or blocked. Anger motivates us to take action, which can be exactly what is needed in a given situation. We just want to be effective in how we act, so we may want to slow things down, check the facts, and then proceed wisely. Next slide, please. As Dr. Jung said earlier, COVID did not cause the inequities in our health, school, and social systems. These inequities were pre-existing and now are more visible and also exacerbated. The range of the experience of inequities is immense and varied, so today we are only barely scratching the surface of a majorly significant issue. Teens, as well as parents, can have many different emotional reactions to inequities, and for some, these emotions can be quite intense. When others have more than you may feel anger, sadness, envy, anxiety. When you have more than others, you may feel guilt, sadness, anxiety, and anger. How your teen reacts will depend on many factors, such as what their personal experience has been during COVID, who they are comparing themselves to, and where they are developmentally in terms of focusing on themselves and their immediate environment, versus being able to see a much bigger and more complicated world. While adolescence is a time associated with identifying more with peers, conversations with and guidance from parents remains incredibly important. Try to approach these conversations rather than avoid them, and encourage your teen to talk with you about what they are noticing and feeling. You can also bring up things yourself that you're noticing to start a dialogue. While you may not have solutions, at least certainly not simple ones, you can provide validation. The way that COVID has affected people has not been even or fair. In many ways, kids have had to grow up fast this year and have been exposed to more real-life adult issues. They see and hear about inequities every day, in the news, on social media, in their own backyard. Parents can provide a safe place to talk about complicated and emotionally charged issues. For families with more privilege, you can also encourage the practice of gratitude for what you have, while still balancing this with validating your own difficulties. You can learn more about the history of social injustice and aim to do this with your teen. You and your teen can take action together, perhaps by raising, donating money, volunteering, writing to politicians. As we have discussed today, adolescence can be a time of more intense emotions and novelty-seeking behaviors. It is also a time of passion and of thinking outside the box. Our communities and our world can benefit from these strengths, perhaps even more so now. Parents can encourage and foster this enthusiasm, this creativity, these new ways of thinking, and this motivation for change. So let's listen to our teens. They often have a lot to say. Next slide, please. So remembering that many of the emotional reactions we are seeing may be normative responses to not normal times. It's likely going to take all of us some time to adjust to in-person activities after being mostly home for over a year. And for some teens, it's going to take more time than for others. Not everyone will respond in exactly the same way or at the same pace. Helping our teens acknowledge and manage emotions provides opportunity for connection, as well as helping to teach them valuable life skills. There have been increases in reports of anxiety, depression, stress, and distress in teens during COVID. If your teen is continuing to struggle to return to in-person activities, or if emotions are long-lasting and getting in the way of daily life, you may want to get additional support. You can check the facts with other parents, with teachers, with school counselors, with doctors, and you can also look into cognitive behavior therapy options for anxiety and depression. And of course, you can refer back to the Stanford Parenting Center as well. So thank you again for joining us today. And I believe we now have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jung and Dr. Fordwood, for such a thoughtful and comprehensive webinar. Just like Dr. Fordwood said, we'll move on to some Q&A. So the first question is, how do I know if emotions or stress are more related to typical development or an external stressor like COVID? And does this impact how I address it?
I can start with that, and then Dr. Ford, you can chime in as well. I hate to give the answer, it depends, but I think it kind of depends. And I think it's probably a mix. You know, it's hard to really separate, you know, ourselves from our environment. And so I think that's partly why we tried to cover both the typical adolescent development as well as kind of the changing COVID landscape. So I think just asking your teen, you know, to share more about what's going on and to listen to all of it. You know, they may not know what's going on, if it's kind of them or the environment or both. So I think just kind of opening that dialogue is the most important part, which kind of addresses the second part, which is, does it matter? I mean, again, you know, can you take action on it? Is it something in the environment that you can shift or change? You know, that's something definitely to think about. And then there's also a place for accepting kind of discomfort that we all would like to kind of get rid of, but maybe it's something we just have to manage and work with. So I don't know, Dr. Ford, if you had any additional points.
I think too, you could also see if what you're seeing in terms of emotions is changing over time. So as things are, I don't really like the phrase back to normal, although it's common, it's a common phrase these days. As things are opening up and there's more return to in-person activities, you know, if you're still seeing those difficulties, then maybe it's less about, you know, COVID restrictions and COVID itself. So, and I think either way, like we talked about, if the problems are long lasting, if it's really getting in the way of daily activities, then that, no matter what the cause is, you'd want then to get additional support.
That's a great point. Yeah, and in addition to that, I guess if these issues were happening before COVID, then it probably is actually, you know, there's a big part of that that's having to do with your teen, you know, more than the environment. So that's another way to check.
Thank you. Very helpful. And another question coming in through the chat here is, can you talk about anger management tools for teens? Okay,
so I think there's a short-term and a longer-term answer for this. So as you probably saw in the talk, one of the go-to skills is validation. So validation talk about the anger, acknowledge what, acknowledge that you're seeing it, try to understand what the anger is about. And if you are wanting to bring down anger, even if the anger fits the facts, you may want to bring it down so you can act more effectively. You can try some physiologically based skills, like practicing deep breathing. There's a skill called ice diving, where you can change your physiology by changing the temperature, by dunking your face in cold ice water to bring down intense anger. And intense exercise can also help. So those are some ways you can change it physiologically. There's also ways you can change anger more cognitively and manage the anger, noticing really angry thoughts, trying to take out judgments, trying to watch out for extreme thinking, having your thoughts more accurately reflect the situation at hand. An opposite action for anger would be to gently avoid a situation rather than storming out and slamming the door, to gently avoid. An opposite action all the way for anger would be to think about, the positives that this person has done for you and practice being a little bit kind. So it really depends on whether the anger fits the facts or not. If you are actually being attacked or if an important activity is being blocked, then the anger would fit the facts. Or if the anger and its intensity really does not fit the facts and you want to decrease the intensity of it.
Thanks so much, Dr. Fordwood. Yeah, I love that. Even if it does fit the facts, also, is it effective? How do you achieve your goal? Yeah, especially for an adolescent. Yeah, thank you. Another question coming in is, how do you continue to motivate teens without adding too much pressure?
I can take a shot and then Dr. Fordwood. I'm a great believer in positive reinforcement. So if your teen is doing something, even if it's not exactly what you want them to do, but in the realm, just letting them know that, and however you want, by verbally or by kind of helping them with it. So I think just showing your appreciation and your positive affect around something that you like can often have them want to do more of that. So that's one way. I don't know, Dr. Fordwood, if you have another suggestion.
No, yeah, absolutely agree with you on the positive reinforcement. And you also can try to talk with your teen about what their long-term goals and values are. Because if they know where they want to go and what they want to be doing in the future, then you can try to link the more immediate actions that you're wanting to see more of or that they would need to be doing in order to get to the long-term goals. So it's linking short-term actions to those longer-term goals and having it be in their words. So it's less so coming from you, it's kind of coming from them through your guidance.
Thank you. Another question coming in through the chat here is, any books you recommend for parents? I assume for adolescents. You mentioned Dan Siegel earlier.
Yeah, Dan Siegel's book, Brainstorm, is actually written for teens and for parents. So I think that one would be a good place to start in terms of adolescent development. And what I really like about how he phrases or how he expresses his work is many of the positives associated with the teenage years, in addition to what can be challenging, but also like what are all the positives at that time. And a lot of the skills and strategies that we were talking about today are based in cognitive behavior therapy and also dialectical behavior therapy. So doing some reading about those two approaches in terms of skills and strategies can also be helpful.
Okay, so Here's another question. Thank you so much for all these great questions to the audience. My 13-year-old daughter wasn't very social prior to COVID, and I'm concerned this has made her even more so. She doesn't connect with any past friends. I'm concerned about her participation in camps. Suggestions on how to help ease into camps even before we hit the new school year.
I think that's so normal. I mean, it's just been such a, you know, especially at that age, such an odd year, and there's probably so much going on in a 13-year-old in terms of, you know, their own identity and kind of, you know, a different school year, maybe even going from middle school to high school. As Dr. Fordwood said, validating, you know, all the stuff that teens are experiencing right now probably are really legitimate, you know. It's just a lot. It's a lot for us to take in. And then if we consider like someone who is not an adult, who hasn't had as many years of experience in life, I think it's really discombobulating. You know, kind of gently validating and trying to kind of scaffold, having her step in, you know, to not avoid. I mean, I think it's really tempting to kind of, you know, not want our kids to feel uncomfortable, but social anxiety is one of those areas where it's not dangerous, it's just really uncomfortable. And so maybe even, you know, if she's really, really concerned or anxious, having her go to part of the camp, or, you know, scaffolding kind of the amount of time she spends there, kind of getting a sense from her what she thinks she can do, kind of working with her. Dr. Fordwood, I don't know if you had any suggestions.
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. And before the camp, finding some smaller steps that maybe feel more doable. And, you know, again, just like a social anxiety group, a social anxiety skills group could be helpful. As you said, that this was, the anxiety was an issue even before COVID. So that's another idea as well.
And this might be your last question. Can you discuss how to give consequences when rules are broken, given that grounding and removal of phone are very loaded, maybe not great ideas in this current context?
Oh, the hardest question for
Yeah.
last.
You know, we talked a little bit about this in the managing anger about restrictions. And what I would recommend is having a behavioral contract written down, and saving those more kind of negative consequences, those punishments, for really, really top priority issues. So as Dr. Jung said earlier, using positive reinforcement to shape the behaviors that you want to see. So rewards for coming home on time for curfew can be another way to flip this around. So you're not just putting in punishments for missing curfew, it's how can you reward being home on time for curfew. If the punishment is clearly written out ahead of time, the consequence, so then the teen knows ahead of time, you know, what's going to happen if I break this top priority rule. And then you can let the contract kind of do the work for you. It's not a surprise. Try to not make those decisions in the moment when you might be feeling really upset and emotional, having it all planned out ahead of time.
Anything you want to add, Dr. Jung, before we?
No, I agree with all of that as well. And I think, you know, especially if you can work on that contract before something becomes heated, because not that I would know this myself or have this experience, but if you say something like, I'm going to take away your phone, you've already said it. And if you kind of go back on that, it doesn't make kind of the guideline as effective. So, you know, just working on it when things are kind of, when you're not having a problem, really, so that you can go into it already prepared. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. So important. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jung and Dr. Fordwood, for your wonderful presentation and sharing your Again, very thoughtful expertise with us today. We very much appreciate it. And thank you so much to the audience and your participation and your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. I noticed some of the remaining questions are related to anxiety. And so just so you know, we are offering the small psychoed parent groups, and one of them is targeted for anxiety. So if you want more information on that, please visit our website. Thank you all again and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.